Hitler got into power in 1933, and the first thing he did was to sideline the legislature, the Reichstag, and the legislature had no further power from 1933 until 1945. And that is one reason why Hitler was able to do what he did. We want to make sure that if Trump is able to pack the courts, at least the legislature will still be a stopgap. And that's absolutely essential.
Welcome to the show, Mr. Richard Abel. How are you today?
I'm very good. And you?
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You have a series of books that's coming out. You've written a lot of books, as I can tell. You have a lot of books. Probably more books than I have on the shelf next to me, actually. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what you do, and give us a little summary of the books that are coming out. You have one that's coming out next year, right?
That's right, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I'll start from the present and then fill in the background, just so people know what it is I'm trying to explain. So I've written 3 books about the Trump administration in a series called Defending American Democracy. They are, actually going to hold them up since I have them here and the audience can see them. They are How Autocrats Abuse Power, How Autocrats Attack Expertise, How Autocrats Seek Power, and the 4th, which I'm working on and will complete right after Election Day, is How Autocrats Are Held Accountable. So let me tell you how I came to write those books and something about what's in them. I had written, I'll go back to two steps, really. I did a book about the role of law in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. I went to South Africa in 1989 and then several more times between then and 1994. And it was an extraordinary moment. When I first went, there were 30,000 people in indefinite detention without trial, many of whom were on hunger strike, in what was almost the 50th year of the long struggle against apartheid. And then it turned around. And law and lawyers played a significant role in that turnaround. So I wrote a book about the specific role of lawyers, the court struggles of various kinds. It was an exciting moment, and it was a successful story. And I'm very proud and grateful for the fact that Nelson Mandela wrote a foreword to the book in which he said, indeed, it was the attachment of South Africans to law and the rule of law that made it possible to have a peaceful transition from a white racist regime to a multi-party democracy. So that was a wonderful experience. Then, and this is actually for your Californians because they will understand this, I think, quite well. In 2004, I was backpacking in Grand Canyon, and I was driving back on a Sunday morning from Grand Canyon to Los Angeles. That's a very long, straight road through the desert. No traffic, Sunday morning, but you can get NPR. So I turned it on, and it was Weekend Edition, and I listened to Seymour Hersh break the story of Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib was the prison in Iraq in which the prison guards brutalized the inmates in all sorts of ways, sexual and others. And there was an inquiry into that by General Taguba and a report. Hersh got a hold of that, and he did a series of articles in the New Yorker and went on radio and television as well. That was a pivotal moment because it really brought home to Americans how the war on terror was being waged 3 years into the war on terror, which began with the attacks in 2001. It was a very powerful story, but I had a particular connection to it because Cy Hersh is my brother-in-law, and I followed his journalism for now 60 years. He's a little bit older than me, but we've grown up together. And I remember when he broke the story of My Lai during the Vietnam War, which again was a pivotal moment. That was the massacre of Vietnamese civilians by American soldiers, and it really did turn the war around. So I thought, okay, I've got this personal connection, and I want to see whether the United States, in waging its war on terror, will be more faithful to the rule of law than South Africa was under apartheid, and whether law will have greater influence on the way the war is waged than lawyers did in South Africa. And I expected it would, because the U.S. had a written constitution, South Africa had none. The U.S. had judicial review, South Africa had none. U.S. had a multi-party system, South Africa had just a national party. U.S. had a large integrated legal system. It had judges with lifetime tenure who were independent. Despite all of that, in fact, the legal history of the war on terror is quite dismal. There are still people in Guantanamo who have been kept there without trial since 2002, and there's no prospect of their being released in the future. That's an atrocity.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Did you have a question or comment?
No, no, I said, wow, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. There were habeas corpus cases brought in the District of Columbia courts, and the Supreme Court had held that these people had a right to habeas corpus. Many of the district judges granted habeas corpus, and then they were all reversed. Not a single person was ever released through habeas corpus from Guantanamo. The people who engaged in the torture were never held to account. The Center for Constitutional Rights had brought a number of cases. I did some research at the center, brought a number of cases, including one against military contractors who had hired some of those prison guards. That case just went to trial in the Eastern District of Virginia after 20 years, and unfortunately the jury deadlocked, so there was no verdict, and the case is going to have to be tried again. Yeah, so I spent 14 years writing those two books. They were very long books, and I finished them in 2018. And I went on the road to do a book talks. And the one question people had was, well, you've written a book about the Bush administration, about the Obama administration. Now we're 2 years into the Trump administration. Surely you're going to write a book about the Trump administration. To which I said, absolutely not. Because the Trump administration was a different animal. I have many criticisms of both Bush and Obama, more of Bush than of Obama, but I have criticism of Obama as well. But both of them, and especially their appointees, retained basic fidelity to the rule of law and to the Constitution. Bush himself decided to end torture at one point, and agreed to that. So the difference is Trump has none of those characteristics. But I'm a compulsive note taker. I never stop taking notes on what I read in the papers and online. And at the end of 2020, I went back and read those notes, and I realized there was another book to write, and it was about Trump. So I wrote what actually was a very long book, and I showed it to a bunch of publishers. And there was one publisher who was interested, which is my publisher, Routledge. And they said, by the way, because I hadn't told them this, how long is this manuscript, which I concealed? It was 400,000 words. And they said, we can't publish. There's no commercial market for books of 400,000 words. But could you possibly break it into pieces? And I thought about that, and I realized it really did better as 3 books at the time, and now 4 books. So let me say a little about what those books are and how they're connected. So they're not sequential. They're not a chronological history, but in a sense, they follow the following logical sequence. How autocrats seek power is about the 2016 election and then Trump's attempt to hold on to power despite his defeat in 2020. How autocrats abuse power is about Trump's major policy initiative, which he ran on in 2016 and again in 2020, and is now doing again in 2024, which is the attack on immigrants and immigration. So I wrote mostly about that. The striking thing there is that every one of Trump's immigration policies, which he had to implement through executive orders because he did not have control of Congress, all but one of those was struck down. The only one that wasn't struck down was the third of the Muslim bans. And I can come back and talk more
Mm-hmm.
about that in a minute. So that was a large part of the book. And the other part of the book was what Trump did to protect his cronies who were prosecuted for their involvement in Russia's attempt to influence the 2016 election. So four of his cronies were prosecuted. They were all convicted of quite serious federal crimes. And then Trump ordered his attorney general, who was Bill Barr, to replace the prosecutors who had handled those cases. Barr did that. The career prosecutors who could not be replaced quit the case because they felt that they were being overruled for political reasons. And Trump managed to either reduce the sentences or finally he pardoned all four of them.
Mm-hmm.
He also pardoned many of the war criminals that had been convicted during the war on terror and some of his own cronies and political supporters. So that was the book about abuses of power. And the third was about the pandemic, because the single largest challenge that Trump encountered during his presidency was in his final year in office in January, February 2020, when the pandemic hit. I'm happy to go back and say something more about the details of that. But Trump first tried to pretend that we would never have the virus, then that it would not be serious, then that it would go away when it warmed up, then that you could take flu vaccines and that would cure it, then that hydroxychloroquine would be a cure, which it was not, then that ivermectin was great, although it was a horse medicine and had terrible side effects. He brought in quack doctors. They were doctors, but they were quacks also,
Mm-hmm.
to argue that herd immunity was the way to go. Everybody should get it, and then nobody else would get it. But lots of people would die in the process. He tried to rush the vaccine through the approval process in time for the election. Fortunately, the drug companies who did valiant work in developing it refused to do that, and it went through all of the clinical trials. And it was
Mm-hmm.
salvation, but it was late. Had we taken the precautions that Trump resisted during the roughly year before the vaccine was available, it is estimated that 1 million lives would have been saved. And
Wow.
I include that in a series of books that is otherwise about law, because this is about expertise. Law is a form of expertise, but this is about medical and public health expertise. And I was concerned about it because the attack on expertise, which Trump himself waged, and which of course is being waged by RFK Jr. and other people, is very frightening. Um, and there is a loss of faith in experts, which is to some extent mystifying, but I think profoundly corrosive. So those are those three books. I'll just say a word about the fourth book and then go back to some of your questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the fourth book actually began as the final chapter to the long manuscript, and it was about what happened after January 6th, 2021. And I realized that carrying that forward, I had to write a whole book about that and to include everything that has happened since then. So that is about first the second impeachment, then the special committee and its hearings, then the attempts to invoke the 14th Amendment, which, as we know, failed, then the prosecutions of those accused for riot on January 6th from entering and trashing the Capitol. I'll come back to that in detail if you like. And now, of course, the two more things. The pending criminal cases, the two federal cases in Florida and in Washington, and the two criminal cases, the ongoing one in New York and the one that's still pending in Atlanta. And then finally, the campaign itself, where I focus on what Trump has been doing that's similar to and different from what he did in the previous campaigns. And the bottom line there is it's very similar, but the language has become more violent, more profane, more just incredible. I mean, Trump has said, I don't have the words in front of me, but this is very close to a quote, "I do not feel I am bound by the Constitution." And Trump, of course, has called immigrants animals, vermin, and has said they are polluting the blood of America, which is a
Mm-hmm.
direct quote from Nazi propaganda.
Yeah. And so when you talk about one of the things that I think is like really a huge problem right now is the attack on expertise. And it seems like what we have, and being that I'm from the health food industry, I had a front row seat during COVID, right? During COVID, we saw left wing people that were generally very skeptical of the government, very skeptical of pharmaceuticals, begin to make a little bit of a right lean, or as my boss once said, the extremes met around the back. The extreme right, the MAGA Republicans, and the left wing conspiracy theorists, anti pharmaceutical, anti government types tended to come around and find some common cause. And I think that what we see now, and you can verify whether or not this is something that Trump is doing on purpose for me, is you're starting to see people that generally would not have sided with somebody like Trump, that would maybe be more of an RFK type of person, that are now siding with Trump because they think he's in some way a victim, that he's being attacked, that all of this stuff is being made up because he is shaking up the system. He's draining the swamp, as he says. He uses all these like specific keywords that, in my opinion, kind of activate, the brainwashing of his followers. Do you think that the way he speaks is actively trying to get people to become more conspiratorial, to be more towards those left-leaning people, and to get them to side with him, since he already has the QAnons and the far-right Republicans?
No, I do, and I'm both baffled and troubled by the attack on expertise and the attack on bureaucracy. And
Mm-hmm.
let me say something about each of those. First, about bureaucracy. I mean, nobody loves bureaucracy. We all encounter it in various forms. We have to renew our licenses at the DMV. We have to file our income tax. We have to get our Social Security payments. We can find it very, very frustrating. All of that is true. It's also true that lots of bureaucrats are extremely well-meaning, intelligent, and hardworking people. I remember I was at the DMV. Every 5 years I've got to go and get retested because I'm over 70 or 75, whatever it is. So I was at the DMV and I passed the test, and I witnessed a Russian immigrant, I could tell from her accent, with not a lot of English, who had failed the written part of the test and was very upset. And I watched an African American woman who was clearly a long time civil service employee of the DMV talk her down, explain to her what she gotten wrong, explain when she could come back, how she could prepare for the test, and basically hold her hand. That's something that she must have to do many times a day, every day of the year for 40 years until she gets her pension. And I thanked her for it in person, and I wrote a letter to a superior, because I think that's the kind of conduct that deserves praise, and we ought to acknowledge it more often. So the fact is, we need bureaucracies. We have large systems. They are the people who make them work. But I understand people's frustration. Expertise is a different matter. What I don't understand is why we blindly, blithely, willingly rely on some experts and diss other experts. So the attack on the vaccine, the attack on the pharmaceutical companies, a vaccine that saved millions of lives, a vaccine that other vaccines which all school children get in order to enroll in school, and which again have saved hundreds of millions of lives. Why is there this anger and suspicion of vaccines when, let me give you the counterexample, people who fly in planes, I think, are really quite happy that the Federal Aviation Agency is going to insist that Boeing find out why the doors are flying off their airplanes, and would not be happy flying in airplanes that were not regulated by the FAA. Maybe, do you have any thoughts about why people like some kinds of regulation and are suspicious of others?
What I believe it is the complication of something like a vaccine. So when you think about something like an airplane or Boeing losing its doors or whatever, it's pretty easy to understand what kind of consequences come from not having a safe airplane to fly in. But things like vaccines, really, I don't think that the average everyday voter can put themselves on the level of an Anthony Fauci. You know, he was the top virologist in the nation when he was standing up there. And if I remember right, he was appointed by Donald Trump. Was that correct?
Well, he had a civil service appointment, but you're right. He was
Okay.
given that central role by Trump. Again, I find it interesting and again very distressing that he became the villain.
Yeah.
Trump said
Yeah.
in a campaign rally shortly before the 2020 election, he was asked, people were shouting, "Fire Fauci," and he said, "Well, wait. Once I win the election, I'm going to fire him. I'm not going to do it now."
Oh my
So
God.
people seem to need a villain, and there's nothing about Fauci's personality that made him an obvious villain at all. But they needed somebody, and so they made it him.
I think specifically right now, what we have is a culture that is educated through 60-second TikToks and headlines in the news, and that's what they call information research. Or specifically right now, a lot of people link to Twitter, right? They say, oh, this guy said on Twitter, Mercola said on Twitter, Fauci, one of the crazy conspiracy theories was Fauci had committed or invented AIDS, you know, and these are these big ideas that people can't wrap their mind around. And even if you want to disprove them, you have to spend a lot of time looking into them and figuring out whether or not they're real or not. Now, I do that because I'm interested in it. But I think the majority of people nowadays want to just kind of say, oh, well, you know, it seems shady. I say this all the time. There, I think and I feel statements. I feel like it's shady. I think that this guy could have done it. So when you ask, you know, why are those people the villains? I think because genuinely people don't understand how much work they've put in their entire life to become an expert in their field and want to believe that their 60 seconds of watching TikToks or reading headlines is just as valuable as that person's 40, 50, 60 years of expertise. Does that
There's
sound about right?
certainly there's certainly a sense of resentment against experts, that they have status, that Fauci actually had a very good salary. I think it was 400,000 a year, which is very high for a federal employee. But it also is true that he earned it by 60 years of work, to gain the expertise. But people are resentful of that. But
That's a
I
good
think
point.
there's something more basic than that. I think people feel are anxious and they feel powerless. The world is changing rapidly. There are all sorts of technologies that they're dependent on that they don't understand. There are changes in the society that they feel they can't control. They want simple answers. They want somebody to tell them what it's like. Conspiracy theories are an obvious, simple answer to a very complex situation. And so people grab onto them, and it's very hard to get them to change their minds. I was reading something interesting in the paper today. This is not about Trump specifically. It's about the adoption of electric vehicles. So I'm at a point where I'm thinking about it, but I haven't done it yet. But so I'm doing a little bit of research and I'm thinking about it. And the article said, well, it turns out that Democrats are about twice as likely to say that they are thinking about adopting an EV than Republicans. And then you ask Republicans, why is that? And they say, well, because Biden is for it. And if Biden's for it, I'm against it. It's as simple as that. There's an old Groucho Marx jingle. Anything, whatever you're for, I'm against it. It's part of a longer song. And that really is the way the two parties feel about each other, especially, I think, the Republican Party. So the question is, how can you change people's minds? And the article was saying what you can show them is that in a fairly short period of time, an EV is going to be cheaper. It's not just that it's going to be better for the world and the environment. It's actually going to be cheaper. And you can show them, I mean, knowing what it costs to charge, a tank to fill your gas tank these days, that's an easy sell in many ways. So you've got to show people that their lives are going to be better in the short run, not that it's going to be great for everybody else. And that I think is part of it. Again, going back to the vaccines, I think one way of selling them would have been to say to people, do you have an elderly relative? Because you may not
Hmm.
be afraid of getting COVID, but your elderly relative, the death rates for people over 60, 70, and 80 are extraordinarily high. And if you get COVID, you can transmit it and you will be asymptomatic and contagious for a period of time. So think about that, not about yourself, but about the people you really care about.
Yeah, and so the villain really should be in this, something that we all should have been able to wrap our minds around and become really united on, was the virus. The virus itself was what should have been the villain. And I think that, part of that was, as you said, Donald Trump, the way he spoke about the virus at the beginning. Oh, this person, it was just one person. They landed in San Francisco. We've already dealt with it. It's just like the flu. We talked about the, can you inject sunlight? Can you inject bleach? Can you take aquarium cleaner or horse dewormer? All of these like far-fetched theories or fantasies. I call it dark fantasy politics when people talk about it in this way. Tend to get away from the reality that these things aren't generally as fantastic and dramatic as people want them to be. And I think that we've lost adversity. I think that a guy was telling me the other day, he's saying they're thinking about reintroducing the black bear, the grizzly bear, into California. And he goes, I'm against it. I go, I'm all for it. And he goes, well, what? Why would you want that? I go, because people need real life adversity. Because we're spending way too much time nowadays creating these scenarios, these conspiracy theories, these dark fantasy politic conspiracy theories about Fauci created it and it's all because he wants to make money and all this crazy stuff that they were saying during that time. When the reality is viruses exist and they are deadly to human beings, specifically to immunocompromised people. And I think that Trump started the bad communication. And then I think coming into Biden and Fauci, when Biden took over office, they had a very hard job to do, and that was to communicate to the populace that this was important, not just for them, but like you said, to people that were immunocompromised. And I think that they did fumble that. As you were saying about Obama with Guantanamo Bay, I think that Biden and Fauci fumbled a little bit when they were trying to talk about masks. They didn't seem to come off in the way that they should have. They said masks weren't important, and they did. Then they said, well, the reason we said they weren't was because nurses need PPE. And it was one of those things where it was like, well, yes, we need to just explain this thing in a way that people can understand. And as you said, explaining that your elderly relative that you love could possibly die from this. Maybe not you, but they could, was a very good way to do that. And I think that leads into my next question. You had spoke about immigration. I think immigration is one of these incredibly complicated subjects that people think can be boiled down to open the borders or close the borders. And that's insane. When I keep hearing people on the right specifically say, we'll just close the border. I go, well, you're already saying that these people are coming across the border illegally. You can't just shut the door. That's not how this works. And then I've literally had conversations with people on the right where they say, well, what if you put guns on a wall? And I go, well, imagine being a border patrol agent. I go, they already have increased rates of suicide on the border. I think it was something like 17 border patrol agents had taken their life within the last 4 years. And that's something like 4 times the amount of border patrol agents than New York City police officers, which is like, there's so many more New York City police officers than there are border patrol agents. I go, so if you can imagine, if you're a human being being forced to say to other human beings that are crossing a border, running from human traffickers, from mafia members, from drug dealers, and they're running from this life, and then you're going to put another person on the other side of a river with a gun to take their life, a child, a woman that are crossing. I go, that's just not realistic. Well, okay, well, why don't we, barbed wire and walls and all, it's, I'm like, it's complicated. I literally had somebody say, what about a moat? It's like, no alligators, none of these things. So
we have one. It's called the Rio Grande.
yeah, and it doesn't work. And
Of course.
so what I wanted to ask is, with that, with understanding that people like Trump will use those types of, I think Robert Reich calls it the enemy at the gate, right? Where it's, this is used every election period. Be aware that the Hondurans are coming, the Chinese are coming, the Ghanans, whoever. They're all coming across the border. They're bringing drugs, and they're as Trump said, they're sending the worst. They're emptying their jail cells and sending them over here. Do you feel like Trump doing that is a threat to democracy? Do you think that people like him and himself, obviously, using that type of rhetoric could possibly bring us to something like an autocracy or a dictatorship?
Well, it is a dehumanization, and it will inevitably change people's or affect people's attitudes, or at least permit them to express their racist feelings about people who look like immigrants, which are going to be Latinos, most of whom, in fact, are legal, documented workers, not immigrants. Right. So that's one fear. The dehumanization is, I find, really profoundly troubling. I've been reading for this fourth book in the history of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and these were accounts by German emigres to the United States about their understanding of what the appeal of Hitler was to the people who elected him, because at the end of the day, he got power through an electoral process, which is, of course, is how Trump has gotten power and hopes to get power again. So it is a dehumanization process. And in Germany, of course, the target were the Jews, and now the target is immigrants of various kinds. And Trump I've got to say this, is explicitly racist. He has said on several occasions recently, why can't we have people from nice countries, Norway, Denmark? Why do we have to have people? And then he says the Congo. Well, there isn't actually a Congo. There are two Congos, and they have different names, and they have different, entirely different countries. But for him, the Congo is the Black Menace. There's no question about it. That's what he's trying to instill in people's minds, and it appeals to the worst possible sentiments. I'll say this about immigration. I fully agree with you. It is very complicated, and we can see how complicated it is because every country in the global north is dealing with these problems and dealing with it unsatisfactorily. Look at Britain trying to send the immigrants off to Rwanda. That's never going to work, and it's been trying to do that now for a number of years. Or the number of people dying on boats in the Mediterranean or in the English Channel is truly tragic. But what I have to say about immigration is this: two things. First of all, Trump and the MAGA Republicans prevented any possibility of a bipartisan deal on immigration in this current Congress. And we were actually fairly close to it. And Trump said, I don't want it because it would be a gift to the Democrats. I want to be able to use the immigration issue against them from now through the election. So that's number one. Number two is, you're right, the simple solution, building this infinite wall on the border that goes to the skies and down underground and is armed in all sorts of ways. People are going to find other ways into the country because the forces that are pushing immigration are only going to intensify. And those are twofold, and they are interrelated. One is climate change. And we haven't begun to see how catastrophic that is going to be, because the global south are precisely those countries which are going to become uninhabitable because they're going to become too hot, or they won't be able to grow their crops or whatever. So that's going to be a significant part of it. And then there's the demographic element. This hasn't happened in the United States yet, but we've seen it in many other countries because people are having fewer children in order to replace the workforce. You actually need migration. So Italy relies on migration. Germany relies on migration. All the Nordic countries rely on migration. Japan is increasingly having to rely on migration. Migration is in our future. There's just no question about it. And the question is, how do we handle it? And purely open borders isn't going to work, and there's no possibility of closing borders, and therefore we have to come to a bipartisan solution to it.
Yeah, and so and this is you're just talking about climate change. Right now people are seeing elevated prices in extra virgin olive oil, and if people don't understand why that is, that's because for the past 3 years Spain has experienced extreme drought. We've lost something like production wise 1.1 million metric tons of production. That's 33% of the world's total production. So now you're starting to see elevated prices in the olive oil. Of course, Joe Biden will be blamed for that. But, it's one of these things that when you don't take into account something like climate change, you don't realize that things like the immigration, or I'm sorry, the border problem crisis, as they call it, can become much worse than it is now based off of the evidence of what you're saying there. That actually makes total sense. These southern countries are going to experience climate change at a much different rate. They're going to have different economical problems because luckily here in America, we are pretty well off no matter what people want to say. We have a little bit of an entitlement problem here in America. We're used to having our Netflix and our Uber Eats and all the amenities that comes with America. And anytime we tend to have even a slight pullback on those amenities, we start to get a little bit worked up. But when you have these southern countries that don't have those amenities, they don't have the entitlement issues that we have, and they start moving their way this way, we need to be prepared in a logical fashion to handle that immigration because, like you said, it's very important. We do have a decreasing population in America. We have a problem with Social Security. We have a problem with being mildly top heavy, not as bad as somewhere like Japan is. But if we don't accept that immigration is part of our lifeblood, then we are going to start to experience problems from that, side effects from it. So what I'm saying is, do you think that somebody like Trump could use the potential fear that is created by something like what he terms the border crisis to do something like form an autocracy or a dictatorship?
Yeah, that was one of your questions. So let me get to that to make sure that we get to it in time. Um, Trump has said, and this is one of your questions, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. And then he said that was just a
Mm-hmm.
joke. Trump doesn't make jokes. He's not a very funny man.
No.
He basically says everything he believes. He doesn't have a filter either. So that things that other people would say, you really shouldn't be talking about that. He will say anyhow. Um, so he has said what he's going to do. He has packed the courts with Federalist Society members and has vowed to do more of that. He has claimed that he owns the Supreme Court because he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. So
Mm-hmm.
he has the power in a second term, I think, to render the courts much less of a check and balance on the other two branches of government, which would be a disaster because that's the role the courts have played ever since Marbury against Madison in 1803, judicial review, and that has been one of the reasons why we have a thriving democracy. So that's the courts. Then there
Mm-hmm.
is the civil service. This goes back to expertise in the bureaucracy. At the very end of his term, Trump promulgated through executive order Schedule F, which was
Yep.
an attempt to politicize the civil service, not just at the top levels where it should be political, because those are the people who set basic policies, and they should be consistent with the policy of the executive, but all the way down to the next 50,000 people in the civil service. And unfortunately, a large number of Trump's appointees, political appointees, were incompetents. I can't stress that too strongly. The turnover in
Mm-hmm.
his cabinet was huge, partly because he fired them, partly because people quit, partly because there were scandals, partly because they just didn't know what they were doing. And if you bring that down to the next 50,000 people in the administration, the government simply won't be functioning. So I think there's that fear. And then Trump has said, in effect, if I don't win an election, there aren't going to be any elections. The only election result I'll accept is a win. And there is a
Mm-hmm.
great deal of damage that he can do in 4 years in government to make elections much less meaningful. So I've been giving a bunch of talks at law schools to law students around the country. And the question has come up, should I even bother to vote? I don't think much of Biden, especially now. I'm less enamored of him after the Gaza attacks. But quite apart from that, he's too old, etc., etc. And I say to them, look, if you want to vote for the rest of your life, you have to vote in this election because this may be the last election that we will have. Trump is determined to eliminate elections. He'd like to be president for life. He makes it clear that he envies Putin and Xi and other autocrats, and he will do everything in his power to be like them.
And do you think that something like the Heritage Foundation's 2025, do you think that that sets up exactly what he's looking for? Because it seems like when they talk about dismantling administration, dismantling and giving power to the executive branch, or dismantling other branches and giving power to the executive branch, dismantling the FBI. And I think that this is one of the things I talk with my subscribers about, is that when people say dismantling the FBI, when it's in the 2025 Heritage Foundation plan, they're not talking about getting rid of the FBI. It's much like saying defund the police. It's a little bit of a misunderstood term. It's that he's looking to do exactly what you were just saying he already did, and that is to remove people in the FBI that he dislikes and to put in instead a bunch of people that would agree with him and be lapdogs. Do you think that the 2025 Heritage Foundation plan is going to set him up to do exactly what you just said?
Well, just sticking with the FBI and therefore the larger umbrella of the Department of Justice, which it's part of, he has made it clear, and he said this explicitly, I am the chief executive, and therefore I control everything that happens in government, and I am the ultimate law enforcement authority. So I should be able to hire and fire anybody at any level of the Justice Department or the FBI or the CIA for that matter. And that's clearly what he's going to do. He's going to bring in an attorney general like Bill Barr, who until 2 weeks before the end of his term did everything that Trump asked him to do when he finally decided he wanted to see if he could clean himself up for the next administration. But he'll find somebody even more compliant than Bill Barr who will do exactly what he wants and will prosecute the people he wants prosecuted. Trump is sort of hedged about whether he wants to prosecute Joe Biden, but he certainly wants to prosecute Hunter Biden. He certainly wanted to prosecute Hillary Clinton. He would like to use the Justice Department as an instrument of revenge. He's made that very explicit, just the way Nixon had an enemies list and went after his enemies.
Yeah. And something that I think that people don't take seriously enough, and I myself didn't back in 2016, is exactly what you said about he says what he means. Like, people think he's funny, but really he just insults people, right? I think that that was something that was in some way, the Howard Stern, right? When Howard Stern first came out as a radio jock, the things that he would say was so funny because it was shocking. It was absurd. It was, you'd never heard it on the radio before. So it kind of, it reached to that part of the human being that like makes you go, oh my God, wow, we said that, And sometimes with Trump, that's what happens, is he insults the other person. He says the things, as you said, that emboldens people to be more racist, to be more homophobic, to express the things that they don't understand, so they don't like, the fear of the other. So when we talk about somebody like Trump, and then you take something like the Heritage 2025 plan, which is a Christian nationalist plan, and you take people like you said, Bill Barr was bad enough, but you're going to go one step down even further. What was it? Is it Plan F? What is the one he put in? You said right before he left.
Schedule F, yes.
Schedule F. So with that, you can help me out with this? Does that allow him to fire en masse federal employees?
Yes, yes. And the thing about Schedule F is Trump brought it in at the end of his administration. It was an executive order. Therefore, Biden was able to reverse it in the first early days of his administration. The Democrats in Congress tried to find a bipartisan plan that would make it impossible to bring it back in place. But of course, the Republicans refused to do that. So Trump can simply reinstate it in his first day. And that's what he said he will do. And then he will be able to fire all 50,000 people and put his own henchmen in their place. And as I said, the real fear is that so many of them are incompetent. Take Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller was his senior advisor throughout his entire 4 years, is involved in the Heritage Foundation plan, and has every expectation of coming back in a senior position in a Trump White House. One of the things that Stephen Miller kept on doing was giving Trump legal advice. The problem is Stephen Miller never went to law school. He doesn't know anything about law. And that is the reason why all but one of Trump's immigration policies was struck down, because they were clearly unconstitutional or clearly unauthorized by statute. So the question is, what would happen in a new Trump administration? And there would clearly be people who have even fewer scruples than in the first administration. That much is clear. Would they be more or less competent? And I just don't know the answer to that. I was encouraged by the fact that in Trump's second impeachment, none of the lawyers who had represented him in the first impeachment were willing to be his counsel. I think that more reputable lawyers, that's all I really know about are the lawyers, are backing away from Trump because he's poison. He contaminates you. Look at the number of lawyers who are before disciplinary proceedings as we speak, right? So
Eastman,
Jeff Clark in Washington, John Eastman in California, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell. It's a long list. Basically, every one of the lawyers that Trump picked for his election challenges are either in disciplinary proceedings or threatened with disciplinary proceedings, showing just how far-fetched and wacky their ideas were. But that's what we'll bring in a second term.
Yeah, and that, right, the people that have stayed loyal, the Alina Habas, the Blanche. Let me ask you a question about that, because I've been thinking about this with his ongoing trial. And specifically with the last trial as well, the fraud trial that was brought by Letitia James. First of all, Letitia James, Alvin Bragg, Smith, all of them seem to really have their stuff together. You look at what's going on with Alvin Bragg's trial right now. He's clearly setting up, the witnesses to proceed Cohen, who Cohen obviously did some time for perjury. So, Donald Trump's defense attorneys can push that forth, that he's a liar, he's been to prison, all these things. But Alvin Bragg has done such a good job of setting it up to when Cohen comes on trial, they're going to be able to say, look, he may have perjured, he may have went to jail for this, but here you see all these other people that didn't, that have set up to testify to show that he is telling the truth. On the other side of your Alvin Braggs and your Letitia James are these lawyers that, like you said, seem to me, and I don't know enough about the subject to be an expert on this, but they seem like they're bottom of the barrel. They seem like they are specifically picked because Donald Trump in some way is trying to make a mockery of the judicial system to somehow set himself up to say, look at how I was treated, look at the victim I am. And potentially, I thought in the fraud trial specifically, I felt like he was trying to set it up for a mistrial, or for it to be, once it's sent to the next level, for it to be sent back down to be retried. Do you think that's what's going on with these subpar lawyers that he has, or is it just, is that all he got?
Well, it's a very good question. Todd Blanche, who's his principal lawyer now, doesn't actually have a background in this kind of trial work at all. He was a large firm lawyer doing what large firm lawyers do, basically protecting corporations in various ways. Not clear why he decided to take this on. Some of Trump's women lawyers are eye candy. I think there's no question, but that he likes pretty women. He likes to sit next to them, and that's not really a good basis to choose your lawyers. As someone who taught thousands of law students, I don't think the prettiest or the handsomest were necessarily the best law students, right? Yes, I think that the strategy is to hope for a mistrial and therefore a new trial, so there won't be a conclusion before the election. Since this is a state prosecution, once again, Trump can't prevent it from happening again, so he could be retried. Even if he's a sitting president, he could be retried, I think. I don't think the law on that is a little bit unclear. In the fraud trial, that made no sense because it was being tried to a judge. There was no jury, and all he was doing was alienating the judge day after day after day. And it's clear that he's doing the same thing to Merchan. So I caught the very last snippet of reporting on today's trial. So Stormy Daniels is on the stand. She's testifying. And Trump is cursing under his breath as she's testifying. And Merchan summons Trump's lawyers and says to them, I don't want to embarrass your client in front of the jury, but this has got to stop because this is going to be contempt. You've got to control him. And the problem is nobody can control Trump. Not even Trump can control Trump. So some of it is really um, uh, behavior that he's unaware of. He's never had to control it before. He's always been the center of attention. He's always had surrounded by yes men and yes women, and he just doesn't understand it. I'll just give you one insight into Judge Merchan. I have three brothers-in-law, all of whom are public defenders, one of them in New York. So for the last 40 years, he's been a legal aid lawyer, and he's appeared before all the state judges in a variety of criminal cases, which means that he's appeared before Merchan, not often, but enough to know. He says Merchan is the worst of the worst, by which he means he's the best of the best. That is, Merchan doesn't like defense lawyers, and he doesn't like disorder. He wants to run a tight shop. He wants things to be done his way. Judges are like captains on ships. They have ultimate authority, or generals in the field, right? They're used to being the people who have the last say, and nobody else has a say at all. And Merchan doesn't like the fact that Trump is not listening to him, as shown by the 9 contempt punishments of 1,000 apiece, which is irrelevant to Trump. But also the threat that if this continues, he's going to have to resort to jail, because obviously the $1,000 is not doing the trick. I think Trump says he would like that. I don't think he would like that. Trump hasn't seen the inside of a New York State jail. It's not a pretty place, and the other inmates are not going to be all that happy to see him. So even if he's surrounded by Secret Service all the time, he won't get his showers, he won't get his luxury meals, etc. So he wants to stay out of jail.
Yeah, and Ingeron, that was the prior in the fraud case, right?
Right.
I felt like Donald Trump was trying to get him to get mad and make a mistake, something that could be sent to a higher court to say, obviously this judge was taking out a personal vendetta. Obviously Trump was, just like what you had talked about with him talking about the election being stolen. He seems to set things up, like he wants this thing to happen, and then he says, look, I've said it this whole time, it was going to happen, and then it did. And, I felt like with Ingeron, that's what he was trying to do, was trying to get him to a point where he would lose his cool and attempt to get him to make a mistake that he could then, at one point or another, appeal. But we both know that going into 2024, he's the election this year, he's already setting himself up to lose, right? Like he's already saying it's going to be stolen from me. I've literally heard Trump supporters, one of the things we do on my channel is we watch all the crazy interviews with Trump supporters. And one of the Trump supporters said, we know he's going to lose. We actually do not believe he's going to win because, and the guy goes, well, that's funny. Why are you voting for him then? And he goes, well, it doesn't matter. We can all vote for him. He said 90% of the country is going to vote for him, but they're going to take it away from him anyways. Do you think that that's what he's doing once again? Is it just who Trump is that he says these things, or does he actually have like a kind of a more nefarious plan to that kind of thing?
Well, he is a man who cannot lose. He sees every competition as the ultimate judgment on him. I think he's a man with a very weak ego, and it expresses itself in those forms. So he tried to discredit the 2012 election, the 2016 election, the 2020 election, and now he's doing the same with the 2024 election. And he's doing the same with every court that he appears in. He makes motions to have the judge recuse himself or herself, and then constantly denounces the judge out of court, saying the judge is biased, I can't get a fair trial. So he challenges every institution that could hold him to account in advance, so that when he is held to account, he can refuse to accept their judgment. And yes, I'm sure he will do the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think we do? I mean, obviously earlier you talked about people saying, well, I don't think I should vote, Joe Biden, the way he's handled Israel Hamas, has been, not the way I would like it. You have people that obviously are willing to vote for RFK, instead. I personally am going to vote for Joe Biden, and I tell people on my channel this all the time. I base it not on who Joe Biden is as a person, not on his charisma, not on his speeches, but on his legislation, on things like the Chips and Science Act, like things like the Infrastructure Act, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really a green energy plan, but still, on bipartisan gun law that has been passed during the time he was there, all the college debt that he has erased for so many Americans, and really, to be honest, that was all all done with only 2 years of having a functional House and Senate. And since then, he has done nothing but lead America out of a pandemic, keep us away from a recession, help to wrangle inflation to a proper place where we can maybe get it under control, hopefully in the next 4 years if we vote for the right person. But if we are to keep that going, if we are to keep the momentum of America moving into the next, what I believe is the next industrial revolution, which is AI and green energy, I believe we need to have Joe Biden there because of his legislation, not because of his speeches, not because of his funny jokes. How do we, or what do we do about the people that say, I don't think my vote matters, I don't think I want to vote for Joe Biden because of the Israel-Hamas stuff? What do we do about that?
Well, there are various replies. One would be, think of the people who were disenfranchised for generations, like the black election workers in Georgia, who were, one of whom was told by her grandmother, I wasn't able to vote, you've got to vote because you've got to vote since I wasn't able to do so. The fact is that we don't have people with those memories, and those memories are absolutely essential. So I think you say to people, you have to vote in this election because if you don't vote in this election, there may never be a meaningful election again in which you are able to vote. And I also say to people, if you can't vote for Joe Biden, this is sort of a second position. If you can't vote for Joe Biden, vote in the other races because at least a Democratic Congress, a Democratic House, or a Democratic Senate can prevent the worst things happening in the next 4 years. We would still have deadlock. We would have a non-functioning government, which we've had now for a whole congressional term. But that would be better than the alternative, which would be the destruction of democracy. So that's what I say to people. And I play the age card, which I don't usually do, but I'm 82, and I say this is the most important election I have ever voted for, and the most important election I ever will vote in. So I'm going to vote. I'm going to hold my nose also for a variety of reasons. The other thing I would say about Biden is that he appoints highly qualified people, and Trump does not. So Biden's cabinet was very good. Some of them had impossible jobs, like Mayorkas, but they did the best they could. And Trump has had a terrible history of the appointments he's made, and I think it will get only worse.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point, and thank you for bringing that up about voting in the other races, because that is a very good point as to add some type of stopgap to keep the presidency from running wild if somebody like Donald Trump wins. You have Jamie Raskin, who wrote the foreword to your last book, and I think Jamie Raskin is amazing. I voted for Katie Porter. Personally, I think Adam Schiff is amazing. I think Adam Schiff also great. Really hard decision to make, but I love Katie Porter. I think Katie Porter has really stood against corporations, and that's kind of my big thing right now. And I think people like Katie Porter, like Adam Schiff, like Jamie Raskin, Moskowitz, the African American girl down in Texas. I always mess Jasmine Crockett. I always call her Crowder. It's Jasmine Crockett. Amazing. These are all people that have America's best interests in mind. And I think that that's a great point to say that if you're a person that maybe isn't, loving Joe Biden's policies in the Middle East, at least vote for the people that you can agree with, the Democrats that have put forth legislation, that have stopped other legislation, and have really appealed to the better parts of America rather than the fear, anger, hatred, and vitriol of the right. Why don't you go ahead and tell everybody where to get your books and anything else that to find you?
Yeah, well, the books are available in all the usual places. Independent booksellers of all kinds. They should have stocks of them, and of course, you can get them from Amazon and from the publisher, which is Routledge, Routledge. All of that's available online. They're paperbacks. They're relatively reasonably priced. I would wish they were cheaper, but the price isn't out of sight. I'll just give one last thought, which is this about the importance of the legislature. Again, I said I've been going back and reading the history of Germany in the 1930s, and this is what happened. Hitler got into power in 1933, and the first thing he did was to sideline the legislature, the Reichstag, and the legislature had no further power from 1933 until 1945. And that is one reason why Hitler was able to do what he did. We want to make sure that if Trump is able to pack the courts, at least the legislature will still be a stopgap. And that's absolutely essential. So if you do nothing else, educate yourselves about the people running for Congress and the Senate in your districts and vote for them.
Yeah, that's powerful because I was just listening to somebody talk today about how even with Hitler, it took him a couple months. Things didn't happen overnight. In fact, he had lost the first go at it. He won the second go by being more of a politician. And once he had gotten into office, that those next 2 months for him were just a slow process of taking over and turning it into a dictatorship. And I think we do see something very similar to the crowd that he appealed with. Unfortunately, it hurts to say that about people that we live with, that I look to as other Americans, but it seems as though we have people that believe that things are bad, that they're getting worse, and they will only look up if their guy is in office. And unfortunately, I tell people this all the time. I'm like, you guys could have picked anybody else. Anybody else. Like, Donald Trump is the furthest from the person that you guys believe that he is. Donald Trump doesn't care about you. Donald Trump cares about him, and that's it. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed that conversation. And if you want to see more conversations like that, check out these podcasts. Until next time, remember, get educated and get out and vote.
Hitler got into power in 1933, and the first thing he did was to sideline the legislature